Tony Sampson is a critical theorist with an interest in philosophies of media, technology, and neurocultures. His publications include the Spam Book, co-edited with UC Puerto Rico, my colleague and good friend at Winchester School of Art, Virality, Contagion Theory in the Age of Networks, the Assemblage Brain, Sense Making in Neuroculture, and I know that Hyphen Labs has been carrying around a marked up copy of this, so expect some questions, Tony. And Affect and Social Media, Emotion, Mediation, Anxiety, and Contagion. His next book is called A Sleepwalker's Guide to Social Media, which will be published by Polity Press in 2020. In addition to his published work, Tony is the host and organizer of the Affect and Social Media International Conferences in East London and co-founder of the public engagement initiative, the Cultural Engine Research Group. He currently works as a reader in digital media cultures and communication at the University of East London in the UK.
Crikey, it's a big crowd. I can't do a selfie because I don't have a mobile phone to do it on, but I'll just imagine it. Okay, I'd like to begin by saying thank you to Ryan and Yussi from Winchester for helping organise this with the festival organisers. It's been an amazing conference. I get emails from people reminding me to check in at the airport and that kind of detail. It's amazing stuff, so thank you very much for that. So what I thought I'd do here is try to broadly address some of the themes of the conference itself and this particular session. So in light of the conference theme on emotion, feeling and affect, and then the idea of reworking, or what I'll probably just talk about is working the brain, I wanted to have a kind of broad approach to how we've conceived of the brain, or how the brain image has been conceived of in recent years. And there's been some interesting sort of twists, turns, and paradigm shifts involved here. So, you know, I'm going to kind of broadly kind of approach this in this talk. Okay, so that's not a good start. Okay, so look, you know, before the 1990s, I'm not going to go back too far, we haven't got time to do that. So before the 1990s, we would talk roughly of being in what we might describe as the classic cognitive theoretical frame of the brain. So, you know, you might be familiar with some of these diagrams. In short, it's a kind of metaphor for the brain as computer, or the computer brain, if you like. It's specifically about a brain which is an information processor. It has a number of characteristics to it. You know, it's information in, information out. The processor in the middle works on representations. There's some kind of like storage, memory storage. So you can see the kind of analogy between the computer and the brain. So, you know, you might ask, well, if that's the model in the 1990s, you know, how do we address the kind of themes of this conference? Really, that model was bereft of any kind of mention of emotion. And when emotions were included, things like feelings, affect, emotions were kind of described as marginal, noisy, messy, and even kind of irrational. So we know that things have changed greatly, and that's an image I show to my students to kind of give them some sense of how, you know, having no emotions makes you more rational, and how Spock, the character, kind of fights off the irrational emotion. Right, so, you know, things begin to change, and, you know, I'm keeping this quite broad. I'm going to draw on two neuroscientists, popular neuroscientists, to kind of make this point. There's obviously a lot of work behind this. But we can characterize this kind of shift from the cognitive frame into a new paradigm, right? We can call this the emotional turn by looking at the work of, on the one hand, of Joe Ledoux. Joe Ledoux is a guy who kind of made his name scaring the hell out of rats, by all accounts. So by scaring them, he made this kind of correlation between a part of the brain called the amygdala and the processing of fear, and then traces that kind of upstream to more refined thinking, such things as rats making choices and decisions. Yeah. So similarly, Antonio Damasio, who's probably the more popular and well-known person out of this too, came up with a somatic marker thesis, which I'm sure, again, a lot of you are familiar with. But that's the idea that in some way, you know, affect is kind of registered in the body, and again, is involved in this upstream, downstream movement from kind of, you know, bodily, emotional, affective, feely relationships that directly link to decisions and choices, cognition. So, you can see here the quote at the bottom how Damasio starts distancing himself and this work from the old cognitive paradigm. Emotions and feelings may not be the intruders in the bastion of reason at all. They may be enmeshed in its very networks. And that's kind of like, the shape of that new paradigm. So from my perspective, it's been really interesting in a way that this work has influenced what I kind of see myself as, which is broadly a kind of new materialist, affect theorist. And, Damasio, particularly not just his contra-Cartesian approach, but his kind of alliances with Spinoza, have obviously, had a big impact and validated in some respect some of the ideas from the theorists in affect theory. So, just looking at the first two books along from the Spinoza book, Patricia Clough's Affective Turn, there's direct references to Damasio there. Similarly, Greg and Seaworth's Affect Reader, big books in this kind of area. There are direct references in there to Damasio and of course, others. I've put Kate Howe's new book on there because that is similarly, based on a kind of theory of the non-conscious as established around Damasio. But there's a definite difference between that book and the other two, but I'll get on to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so what we have really here is this kind of these ideas from brain science have given some sort of validation to an idea that the affect exists in some kind of non-conscious way. So not unconscious, the non-conscious. I'm particularly interested in the way that these theories not have an influence, but the way they relate to proto-affect theories. If we look again through to Bergson, Bergson was really interested in the kind of the impulsive decision acts, right? Acts that are kind of impulsive rather than being thought. In fact, if you read some of Bergson, he almost treats cognition as kind of a hesitation that comes at some point after those impulses have kicked in. Whitehead similarly looks at an aesthetic ontology. I love Isabel Stenger's kind of take on Whitehead, which is we think that cognition is like a command post, but actually it's just a mere foothold in the reality, the process and reality. And another great book, of course, is Neo-Finalism, Raymond Royer, who sees perceptual reality, the kind of cognitive part, as secondary to a primacy of absolute survey or absolute sensation. So you can see how these kind of old workings of the non-conscious start to correlate with the stuff that Damasio does and then feeds into affect theory. Okay, just to draw, we'll make a little bit of a fuss about this. There's not a straightforward idea of what the non-conscious is. I don't know if you're familiar with Kate Howe's latest book. There's a rather kind of lively take on new materialism and some criticism of new materialism. So I think you can probably draw a line between these two books in their approach to the non-conscious. One, Kate Howe's one, would be still, I think, working within that cognitive theoretical frame. And we can probably maybe talk a little bit later about this, but Howe's idea of affect is always going to be filtered through cognition, always coming through that sort of consciousness. Without consciousness, we don't experience it. And is critical of new materialism for the reason that really she claims that it ignores consciousness pretty much altogether. So, interesting, but there's a wider reading to be done on that subject. What I want to do, I want to kind of look at this, this paradigm shift, this emotional turn from a design perspective, sort of relating to the panel itself. We can do this by looking at some of the design theories, popular design theories of Don Norman. Don Norman's interesting because he was the first self-declared user experience design consultant. He started off very much squarely in kind of cognitive science and cognitive HCI, human-computer interaction. He published this book in 1988, The Design of Everyday Things, and maybe some of you are familiar with this. But what is interesting here is the kind of diagrams that Norman presents in this book and others who have gone on, very much working in that old kind of cognitive brain model. So we have the world itself is discovered purely through perception. The perception of the world, that's the upper diagram there, where it goes through a whole series of things that involve choice and action. We're really kind of in that information processing model of a brain. My favourite one is the one below this, which is the designer's mental model, which roughly translates to the kind of representation that's kind of stored in memory of some kind, has to match that of the user's mental model. So, you know, in a kind of educational way, this is used as a kind of get designers to think about what the user is experiencing. With some students, we do some interesting kind of ideas around asking them what's in the box, and we say, imagine that there's an elephant in the box, and then you ask them to maybe draw the elephant or imagine it, and in some way to get that kind of way in which representations might be stored in the brain. And of course, they all see similar kind of things. So that, for me, opens a whole can of worms about exactly what is either stored or flashing up or tracing in the brain in some way. But that's the kind of mental model. So by 2003, we can see how Norman, and he references again Damasio directly, has kind of shifted his take into this kind of new paradigm, if you like, or emotional turn. And he publishes the book called Emotional Design, and we get a new diagram. And this is really interesting because everyone's got to have a diagram, right? So this is Don Norman's most famous diagram at the top there. And you know, I'll cut a long story short here. The visceral always rules, right? The visceral always dictates what happens at the level of behaviour and cognition, reflection. So that's Norman's point. And it's really, you know, absolutely tied into this emotional brain thesis. How the brain processes emotional experiences is where he's at, right? So that's Norman. My actual interest is going a little bit kind of into the world of HCI and HCI research, human-computer interaction. And I'm interested in the kind of political side of this more so. My idea or take on human-computer interaction research is really it's about getting the brain to work, or getting the body to work to start off with, about putting it together, putting the brain to work in an efficient way, right? So we can, again, broadly talk about kind of three paradigms here, which map on again to these shifts and turns in brains. So where is the brain in the first paradigm? Well, this is, we won't call it the ergonomic paradigm. It's a management of efficient human-machine coupling, so it's body-machine coupling. In fact, the brain doesn't really fit in very much in that. I used some stuff by Gramsci, you know, who looked at the Fordist factory and said that really the brain was quite, you know, left alone. It was about muscular memory. It was about sort of mechanical habit that was captured by that kind of work. And you could see that trace, and there's some direct links between that kind of Taylorist theory of work and early ergonomics. When we get into the cognitive paradigm, which maps on exactly to that computer-brain metaphor, we start to see things like perception, attention, memory being put to work in the models used by HCI, HCI researchers. And then more recently, anyone who kind of works in this area, either in industry or in academia, you will have noticed that whereas we used to refer to human-computer interaction, increasingly now we're referring to user experience, UX, right? It's a big buzzword. It's certainly the industry in London. I'm not too sure about Germany, but it's huge, you know. The UX consultant is the big design job in the UK. So, you know, I link this to the growth of experience industries. And, you know, this is not a new concept, of course. There's a couple of old references here. But, you know, these experience industries are linked to kind of the experience economy, which you might be familiar with. Alvin Toffler, a long, long time ago, talked about, you know, not about manufactured goods or even ordinary services, but pre-programmed experiences. Sort of rather profound thing about this kind of psychops dominating industries of the future. Similarly, in marketing, you know, there's been a gradual creep. This is from somewhere in the 1980s. One of my students found in a literature review of this kind of desire to explore the aesthetics of a consumption experience. So trying to get into that level of experience rather than pure cognition. Following kind of Nigel Frith's work, we can see how this kind of feeds into what he calls the cultural circuits of capitalism. So I've adapted that into the cultural circuits of experience capitalism. And we see how the ideas of neuroscience, particularly this emotional brain thing, starts to feed into a lot of the texts around you know, consumer branding, marketing. Things like Brainfluence, the most awful titles you can really imagine. The Buying Brain, how to push the button of the buying brain. Of course, a lot of these books are complete crap. But the point is, and this is a very thrifty kind of idea, that you know, the more this stuff becomes rehearsed, the more it becomes the norm. If you know, in London, I go to quite a few industry sort of based seminars, and these diagrams, these books are regurgitated over and over again. It becomes sort of part of the rehearsal of these circuits. Okay, and you can see it embedded in lots of other different ways as well. This is Norman's diagram. This was a piece of software by a Danish company called iMotions, and it was kind of dedicated to user experience design research, but working specifically on emotions. And you just read it, and it's just Damasio repeated over and over again. Right? So that's kind of the broad kind of ideas around we've seen in terms of how the brain has been conceived from cognitive model into emotional model. So what I wanted to do is, in a very kind of Spinoza kind of way, is ask two questions to finish off this talk. First one would be, what can be done to a brain? And then a little bit more optimistic and hopefully relating to some of your work, Hyphen Labs, to ask what can a brain do? A little bit more affirmative. So I'm going to quickly run through these because I'm not too sure how much time I've got left. Is it that or that? It's that, right, yeah, okay. So I'll run through these. Right, I mean, first one is putting the brain to work in terms of emotional contagion. A lot of you will obviously be familiar with the 2014 Facebook, effort to try and make emotions go contagious. So that is one way. There are a whole group of startup companies now in the UK, social media marketing companies, looking at the ways in which they can use emotion to fuel virality, programming memes. I love this quote, people share feelings, not information. Low arousal emotions such as contentment and relaxation are useless in the viral economy. Thanks. Of course, Cambridge Analytica scandal, the whole concentration here was a behavioural science, data analytics. But, I don't know if anyone watched the Channel 4 sting on Cambridge Analytica, whole series of videos, really interesting stuff. And, I haven't got time to read all this, but it's really saying that what they want to do is focus on emotions. I don't think the behavioural analytics and the personality trait stuff is all the story here. It's famous, obviously, for its Trump connection, Brexit, but they're also involved in campaigns in Kenya and Nigeria, which are often less coverage about those in Western texts. Interestingly, the campaigns they run there, they were running dual social media campaigns. One with positive messages from the official candidate, and then a whole stream of really negative, violent videos working at the kind of negative end. So I don't know if you've had time to read that quote, but we'll move on. Another thing is this idea of addiction. This is a book which has kind of got quite a lot of attention the last few years about how you can produce habit-forming technologies. Again, this idea of focusing on triggering negative emotions is really key in this text. So the author argues that you can tap into anxieties to create habit-forming use of technology. Okay, so quickly, what can a brain do? Let's end on some optimistic stuff. Okay, so a lot of these people who create this stuff, again, this was a big kind of story in technology a year ago, possibly, about people working in Silicon Valley, disconnecting, blocking, banning, limiting, controlling, preventing. I present this to students, and they just say, well, there's no way we're going to do that, right? There might be some kind of level of detox, but this isn't going to happen. So I think that's probably a bit of an impasse, right? So we've also talked about reverse engineering things like the hook. So, getting people to know their triggers, know that when they're checking endlessly at those notifications, that is the anxiety feeding kind of a design, trying to get people, hooked in that particular way. More interestingly, I'm going back to neuroscience, and hopefully we can discuss this a little bit more. The work of Thomas Metzinger is interesting here, because Metzinger, specifically talks about using psychoactive drugs and neurotechnologies to rewire the brain, right? Rework the brain in a way which we might be talking here. I'm not a big fan of Metzinger. The whole idea of the brain being like a virtual reality Plato's cave seems kind of ridiculous. And also, the idea that there's sort of like a second level of representation, like a magical level. I don't agree with that. Stephen Shaviro does a really good take on that. But anyway, the point I want to make here, and following some positive stuff is, but really there's a lot of stuff about filters being on or filters being off in a brain. Metzinger seems to be one of these advocates of kind of LSD in a way to take the filters off, right? And there was some research recently, a couple of days ago, where brain scans have kind of looked at people on LSD, and it seems to cut off information. So it stops the flood of stuff coming in. So one of the desires of kind of Bergson and a guy called Broad, who was influential around that time, was how can we take those filters off? There's different ways. I mean, I'd love to talk about that because I think in a way that's what your work is doing with the Hyphen Labs. I'm interested in filters being on in this particular sense of experience design, because Benjamin Bratton's quote here, right, about speculative design, he talks about the muffling effects of intuitive, neurological and emotional comfort zones. And I do think sometimes, that design to make people feel at ease and comfort is in a way putting filters on. Okay, and just to conclude, right, okay, going back to kind of the philosophy and how can we use this stuff to actually do anything of any worth, obviously an endless kind of struggle. I mean, there's an interesting couple of books been released in the last couple of years. First one is, William Connolly's Aspirational Fascism, which directly addresses this kind of current war we have on cultural multiplicity. It's a really interesting book because it talks about the visceral register in which this white working class constituent who votes for Donald Trump, for example, and we've got plenty of those sort of types in the UK as well, and I met some in the bar last night in Germany as well. These people operate on the visceral level. I mean, the real point that Connolly makes is liberals tend to have this kind of idea of refined thinking will save the day. And he talks about, more closely aligning the refined, reasoned thinking of the kind of liberal with those visceral kind of registers in which these people exist, right? And, this stuff is now on social media. It's spreading. I think people like Patricia Clough and her kind of take on the kind of more than human, user. I mean, not just the user and the user brain and a singular brain, but this kind of collective non-conscious, not the collective conscious, not the Durkheimian idea, but a collective non-conscious is where we should possibly focus.